So today we're going to talk about approaches to ethics. This week we're covering a number of approaches to ethics, including virtue ethics, principle-based ethics, which is deontology, and utilitarian-based ethics or consequence-based ethics. So there's three major schools of thought on uh, approaching ethics, and uh, we apply them to public administrators in this class, but they really apply to all people as to how do we decide between right and wrong. So I just want to take a little time to go over each of the three, uh, and the other materials in the course will explain further. So virtue-based ethics is associated with Aristotle, and the focus in virtue-based ethics is on being a good person. Being a good person comes from your character. It comes from within. It's asking yourself, who shall I be? And you become a good person by doing good things. And so there's an emphasis on goodness and performing good acts, and it's more intrinsic. The nice thing about this approach is that it allows you to draw on the ethical standards of society. That it's not it doesn't rely on an external source for what's good and bad. It relies on the internal. I am a good person because I do good things. It makes me a good person. So you don't need to know and be educated on what's good and what's wrong and what values to have because it's intrinsic. It's something that's in you, and you are a good person by doing good things. The disadvantage is that it's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you what you should do in a situation. It doesn't when you're faced with a situation, it doesn't give you any guidance. It's well, do what a good person would do. Uh, so that's the disadvantage to virtue ethics. It can also lead to this sense of moral superiority. So some people who view themselves as good people and they're virtuous people and they do good things, and they're morally good people, they end up believing that they're better than other people. That they're better because they're better people. And so there's this sense of moral superiority that comes with that possibly. Um, so the other two schools of thought on approaches to ethics are a principle based approach and a consequence based approach. So the principle based approach is also sometimes referred to as deontology. It's associated with Kant, and um, uh, the principle based approach relies on principles to guide actions. So there's a difference between good and bad, there's right and wrong. What you do should be based on principle. And so you should act in a way that whenever you do anything, it becomes a universal truth. So if you allow something, if you allow yourself to do something that you wouldn't permit somebody else doing in a different situation, then you are not living by this universal truth. So there's a moral standard that you take a principled approach in ethics, that it doesn't matter what the consequences are. A good way to explain this is through lying. So if you think it's okay to tell a lie in a certain situation, then what you're saying is it's always okay to lie because you're putting down this universal truth every time you take an action. According to the principle based approach, if we have these rules, we have these principles, and we don't violate them, they're not conditional on situations. Uh, 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 Stealing is always wrong. So if I justify myself stealing, uh, but I don't justify you stealing, then since that's not universal, I'm violating the ethical code. Why would it be okay for me to steal if it's not okay for you to steal? And if I say it's okay for me to steal, it must be okay for you to steal. And the same thing with lying. You should never tell a lie. There's never any reason to lie. Under the principle-based approach, it's ethically wrong to lie, no matter what the circumstances. So, um, one of the principles, some of the principles of this Kantian principle-based approach, deontology, is that people should never be used in an instrumental way as a means to an end, but we are ends ourselves. Like you shouldn't be using other people to achieve some kind of end, and you should never lie. So you don't take into consideration any of the consequences of your action. There's a big emphasis on truth telling and promise keeping and justice. Some of the issues with this principle based approach. So the advantages are that it provides an ethical source for guidance. Unlike virtue ethics, you actually have some rules to live by. That it gives you some direction. You're not saying, oh well, to be a good person, do good things. You're saying, okay, to be a good person, never lie. Lying is bad. It's wrong. It gives you some principles upon which to act, not because of consequences, but because those principles are good in themselves. Some of the issues are that there's no guidance about ordering principles. So what happens when they come into conflict? When your principles come into conflict, which ones win out? What if you're in a situation where you have to violate one of the principles? It doesn't give you any guidance on that, and it kind of lacks positive motives. You're not thinking about the consequences. You're not thinking about what good you're doing and the value of it. You're just following these rules, and you aren't allowed to take into consideration the consequences of your actions. The utilitarian approach is the opposite. The utilitarian approach is based on a focus on consequences, consequence-based ethics. So you should do, under the utilitarian approach, you should do whatever action has the best outcome or causes the greatest good. So an action is only as good as the ends that it meets. If it has good consequences, then it's a good thing. So this is really flexible. So it's not always wrong to lie. If you are about to go out to eat with your spouse and they ask you how they look in something, and you know that you're going to ruin the night for you and your spouse and everybody involved if you tell them that looks horrible on you, then you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't tell people that they look bad in what they're wearing. You should, even if you think it, you should lie and say, that looks great, let's go have a good time. And that gives you the greatest ends in this case. This consequence-based approach allows you to be dishonest in certain cases when it would actually be good in the sense that it leads to a good outcome to be dishonest. It also allows a lot of public administrators to think about what's best for the greatest good. So if you're doing something for the community and there are winners and losers in politics, and there are winners and losers when public administrators make decisions. When you're trying to figure out what is the best path for economic development in the town or whatever, and utilitarian approach says, well, you do what's best for the greater good, for the most people. So if shutting down the school is going to hurt this neighborhood and it's going to mean longer bus rides for the kids, but it's in the end better for the entire community for X, Y, and Z reasons, then you have an idea of what you should do because the consequences, you understand the consequences. If, the most extreme example of utilitarian ethics is like uh, you 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 have a friend at your house, somebody shows up to kill them, they ask where they are. Under under a principled approach, you're not supposed to lie. You can try and talk them out of it, but you're not supposed to lie. So you're supposed to tell them they're here, and if or try to avoid the question, I guess. But you're not supposed to lie. A utilitarian approach, you go, well, you're trying to. The consequences here are that you're trying to save your friend's life. So it would be permissible to lie there. It would be okay to lie in a case where you're trying to save somebody's life. The 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 One of the biggest issues with the utilitarian approach, it's got the positive effect of being flexible. It's not always wrong to lie. It's not always wrong to steal. What if you're stealing a loaf of bread to feed your family? Um, you know, is that unethical? Like either your kids are going to starve or you steal a loaf of bread. Well, you're going to steal the loaf of bread because you're trying to save your kids. Uh, it's flexible, so it allows people to do what in some context would be unethical and still be ethical. The one of the big problems, the big criticisms of utilitarian ethics is that we don't know what the consequences of our actions really are. There are oftentimes so many unforeseen things that happen because of the actions we take. And since you can't know, Kant would argue that since you can't know the consequences, you should not consider the consequences at all. Because um, you don't know that the food that you steal at the supermarket isn't going to then end up causing an allergic reaction to your kids and killing them. You can't know the consequences of your actions in all cases, and you don't have perfect information, so you shouldn't be um, making decisions based on consequences that you don't know. So it's a really fascinating uh, topic, and it's really interesting to talk about like human nature and how people make decisions and whether they're based on principle or consequences or virtue or how do we or a mixture of all three. It's interesting to think about how do public administrators make decisions? Which approaches do they take? Do they think about themselves as being really good people? Do they think about living on the principles of like I was always raised to never tell a lie, or do they think about okay, I need to do what's best for the community? Um, and that's the three approaches in a nutshell.